Cool. Right. So the last time we introduced this experiment by Phillips et al., which is very interesting because he was comparing the perception of phonological contrast, like te versus de, compared to acoustic contrast, which is basically continuous variation of a certain feature of the sounds, specifically the voice onset time, right? So the time between the onset of the consonant and the onset of the voicing, so the vibration of the vocal cords, and yeah, or glottal vibration, and we saw that basically in their main experiment, what they did was to, after they set up the threshold, so the perceptual boundary for every subject, right? So the perceptual boundary beyond which you would start hearing a de and not a te, or the other way around. So by adding time between the t and the start of the voicing, basically you would turn a te into a de, right? A de into a te. Sorry. So yeah. So what they did was to adopt an oddball methodology. So to present a lot of similar stimuli and then an odd stimuli with a many-to-one ratio, right? The odd stimuli here would be the te, right, which is beyond the perceptual boundary, and above you have a lot of these, okay, and also the other way around. So the last time I told you that they were asking participants to actually categorize, but that was wrong, okay? During the critical experiments, there is no task. So they said that subjects were instructed to attend passively to the stimulus sequence, which was delivered monoaurally to the right ear, okay? And no secondary task was used. So I told you something wrong, sorry about that. So yeah, there was no task during the critical experiment, okay? And then the trick, if you remember, was to keep the difference within the different items the same across the two experiments, but just shift the voice and offset time of all the trials by 20 milliseconds, with the result of turning all these Ds here into Ts perceptually, right? Is this clear? Good. So the prediction about this is that if you shift stuff beyond the threshold of your phonological perception, right, then all these Ds will become Ts. No surprise about that. But also the perception experiment is not going to work anymore as before, because you are modifying the many-to-one ratio basically, right? So the phonological contrast is going to be dramatically changed, right? Although at the acoustic level, the difference is exactly the same, right? The difference between these guys is exactly the same. The only difference is that you moved all these beyond the threshold, right? So what happened? That basically, so the dependent variable, the main outcome of interest was this mismatch magnetic field, which is the correspondent in the MEG of the mismatch negativity, which is an ERP effect when you hear deviant stimulus followed by a lot of non-deviant stimuli, again, audible, right? And what they found is that in the phonological contrast, you have this nice mismatch magnetic field when you hit the audible, okay? When you hear the deviant sound, you have this large difference. And only when you get the deviant sound, right? So you don't get this effect with the non-deviant sounds, although they are also acoustically different one from each other, right? So strong mismatch effect in the phonological experiment and no mismatch effect in the acoustic experiment, okay? So again, this big spike in the magnetic field. And if you remember, the difference between EEG and MEG is that the MEG records the magnetic field of your brain, whereas the EEG records the electricity, the electric field generated by your neuron activity, okay? And the nice thing about the MEG is that it can allow for way more precise localization for several reasons, among which the magnetic field suffers way less from distortions of your skull and the meninges. And also for the property of itself of the magnetic field is very sensitive to localizing the cortical activation. So it kind of combines the temporal resolution of EEG and the spatial resolution of fMRI. Okay. Right. So yeah. So in this respect, the other interesting outcome of this experiment, of this study, is that they were able to localize the effect of the mismatch magnetic field, right? So this effect that arguably generates your feeling of perceiving something different, or perceiving a different sound or a different phonological category, a different phoneme, right? When you hear the instead of the localization of this effect was primary auditory cortex. So not higher level acoustic processing cortices like STS or STG. You remember those who we encountered in the previous experiments, but A1, primary auditory cortex. So, oh, sorry. This is the wrong, yeah, whatever. Doesn't matter. Yeah, so to wrap up, basically what they found was that a many-to-one ratio of phonological categories was sufficient to elicit a mismatched magnetic field, but this difference in the acoustic experiment would not be sufficient to elicit this mismatch effect if the oddball ratio were not maintained by varying, by shifting the voice onset time. And this effect was localized in the primary auditory cortex. So the question they ask is that, is this really the generator of phonological perception? Because we have seen in a lot of experiments that the areas that seem to be specialized for speech processing and for pitch recognition is not A1, because you remember A1 was active for any kind of acoustic stimulation, but it was rather STG or STS, right? And especially STG for pitch perception. And what they found was the effect in primary auditory cortex. So their interpretation of this result was that probably the primary auditory cortex is not the generator of the phonological effect, but in a way it acts as this symbolic representation of phonological categories that probably is built up in different areas. Okay, so you have a sort of feedback of the information. So first you get the information in your primary auditory cortex, then it's transmitted immediately, or maybe in parallel already. As it arrives to the primary auditory cortex, it also arrives to higher level cortices, which process speech and certain features of speech. And then these areas retransmit the information to A1. And probably the feeling of these phonological contrast is really dependent of some sort of message or some sort of information that is ultimately communicated by A1. Okay. So yeah, so they found that basically abstract discrete linguistic categories are available in the part of the brain that is known to be involved in low-level auditory processes, right? And the interesting thing about this study is also that it's a very nice. It shows a nice trick to show you that our perception of speech is really affected by phonological categories, and what you ultimately perceive when it comes to speech is the phonological categories. It's not just a random variation of sound. And then you have this click between one phoneme and the other, right? And this click is discrete, it's not gradual. It kind of happens abruptly when, for instance, the voice onset time with respect to T and D crosses a threshold, okay? So the interesting thing is that with normal sound perception, you can perceive a lot of like fine-grained differences between two sounds. But when it comes to perception of speech, in a way, your brain overrides these small differences and lets you perceive something that is sort of, phonological categories, words, and intelligible speech, basically, when you hear someone speaking. Okay, so again, a nice picture that summarizes this effect is this. So you can continuously vary your voice onset time, right? But you have this 1-0 effect. So when it's smaller than 20 milliseconds, you perceive D. When it's greater than 30 milliseconds, you perceive T. And when it's between 20 and 30 milliseconds, and we are really talking about some very, very small fragment of time, you are very, very undecided, and you see the curve of your response, of your judgment, decreases abruptly from 1 to 0. And you have this small period of time where you're a little bit undecided, right? And then right after that, it's only T and it's not D anymore. Okay? So we are going to wrap up this stuff probably in the next lecture again. But is there any question? Is this all clear? What was this 3 series of experiments on phonology clear? Good. So if everything is clear, it's time to move on to our neurosyntax. Yeah. Yeah, I know that. Thanks. Okay. Good. Do you see the slides? Good. Okay. So why now it's like this? Whatever. Okay, so today we'll introduce a new topic in our course, right? Which is the investigation of how syntax and syntactic information is processed in the brain. Okay. So a nice starting point is this paper by Groczynski and Federici, 2006, which I will upload on Moodle along with the other papers. Sorry, I forgot to upload all the papers yet. So I'm going to do it today, okay? So if you're curious or if you want to dive deeper in any of the studies we talked about, they're going to be there. And so the idea is that what is syntax, right? Syntax is natural classes of operations that assign structural descriptions to sentences via syntactic rules. Okay, so I guess you're quite familiar with this. So the point is, what is neurosyntax then, right? So the idea is that neurosyntax, on one side, is a cerebral localization of syntactic knowledge. So where is the syntactic knowledge localized in our brain? and like to establish a relationship between regular subcomponents of syntactic theory, so operations, structures, representations, and brain loci and brain areas. Okay. So already, in order for this to be possible, you have to believe to some extent that our brain is specialized for syntax, which also presupposes that syntax exists. This sounds, might sound quite stupid to you, but in neuroscience, one of the leading, let's say, convictions, one of the leading hypotheses is that in our brain there is no difference between syntax and semantics. Okay, so these studies, if anything, show that probably there is also some neuroscientific evidence that syntax, the certain areas in our brain are specialized for syntax processing. But this stuff is much, much, much debated. Okay. Right. Yeah. So the idea is that components of syntactic knowledge can be mapped in different brain loci and brain areas. And then on the one side, on the other side, you have something like language processing maps. So here we are not specifically focusing on brain areas and certain kind of information, but we're rather interested in what happens online. So what kind of processes take place during online processing, and what kind of brain activation in real time, as measured with psychophysiological technologies like ERP or MEG. So technologies that are sensitive to brain activation in real time. Okay, right. So which mechanism deal with different knowledge online during sentence analysis, right? And right, whether they form separate neurological units that are distinguishable and localizable. Okay, so I don't wanna spend too much time with this. So there is a nice review that I'm gonna post on Moodle. But this nice paper by Groczynski and Federici, quite outdated, quite old now, is a nice attempt to build very, very simple bridge between certain core operation in syntax and certain areas in the brain. So one of the core operation in syntax is merge, right? Which is basically an operation that combines constituents together and combines words together into constituents and sort of creates trees, right? So yeah, so a man is a noun phrase or a determiner phrase after you merge the determiner a and the noun man. All right. Then you have move, right? You have displacement of syntactic elements, which appear in a certain position in linear order, but arguably they're in a different position in a structure. And you can see that overtly in language. So for instance, you have XP or NP, prepositional phrase movement. When you have stuff like Sam knows that he saw the ballet dancer on Monday, and then if you have that on a WH question, you would say, which dancer does Sam know that he saw on Monday, right? So the idea here is that which, the WH pronoun, in a way at some point is extracted or moves out of this position in which he was the object of this sentence, right? So Sam know that he saw which dancer, right? And in certain languages, you don't have to do this. You can leave it in situ, right? And even in English, you have certain questions like this. But then you have head movement or verb movement, which is kind of evident in simple questions like John is tall. If it's a question, you have to say, is John tall, right? So the idea is where do this movement operation happens, and if we do that, then there must be something in our brain that is responsible for this kind of operation. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit fast now because we are going to come back to these issues. So the idea, and then you have this operation which is called lex, according to them, which is basically just mapping lexical properties of words with the proper syntactic and semantic representation. Okay. So again, according to these guys, this is much of the semantics job, right? So especially Frederici has an idea of semantics, which is really sort of based on lexical semantics. But we know there is much more than that. And we are going to talk about that if we have time in a few classes. But also lexical relations, for instance, have syntactic relevance because, for instance, they provide information about the argument structure of the verb. So the type and the number of arguments that a certain verb requires. Like he ran, only one argument, the subject. He hit Mary, subject and object, 2 arguments. He gave Sue presents, ditransitive, 3 arguments, subject, object, object. Or he gave the assignment to the students, right? 1 direct object, 1 indirect object. Right. And then you have another operation that they call bind, which is basically binding. And that encodes dependencies between positions in the sentence, right? And at the syntactic level, these kind of dependencies are thought to be different from different kind of dependencies, like for instance, displacement and the dependency between a trace and its counterpart. But it would be nice to see whether at the neuronal activation level, at the functional neuroscientific level, these differences that we as theoretical linguists posit, if they're actually psychologically and neuropsychologically real, right? Right. So yeah, an example, John looked at himself. Himself must refer to John, right? Whereas Mary asked John to help her, right? Here is ambiguous. Could refer to Mary or could refer to some other woman relevant in the discourse, right? Okay. All right. So I'm going to give you a very quick overview now, and we are going to come back to this stuff basically in the next classes. But so you don't have to be too much preoccupied if you have no idea what I'm talking about, right? Just to give you a quick sketch. So we know from Broca's aphasia, we talked a little bit about that, that very, very common symptom or classes of symptom associated with Broca's aphasia, along with expressive disorders or the damage to language production, is also agrammatism. So the idea is that in Broca's aphasic patients, the lexical is intact, the binding seems to be intact, the verb movement, the head movement seems to work because lexical aphasians usually are able to do subject-verb inversion in questions, right? So they would be able to say and also understand sentences like have they would left the city versus would have they left the city, but they really, really struggle with XP movement. They really, really struggle with the movement of NP or PP constituents and stuff like this. And right, so from this and also from a lot of convergent studies, activation studies, lesional studies, and so on, there is this strong hypothesis that movement, XP movement, is housed in the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is basically which encompasses Broca's area. Okay, and also a little bit on superior temporal gyrus. Whereas the VP movement or the head movement by activation studies, so not by lesional studies, it seems to be processed more in middle and superior frontal gyrus. Binding seems to be processed by activation study in the right hemisphere middle frontal gyrus and in the middle temporal gyrus, which is also the area where, and also a little bit in the orbital gyrus. So the orbital gyrus is also, it includes BA47, which is the most anterior part of the inferior frontal gyrus. So some people say that it's actually included in Broca's area. Okay, it's yeah, and then the orbitofrontal cortex, which is different from that. Right. So here's the idea from lesional and fMRI studies, and then in the paper they discuss this in relation to ERP studies, right? So, for instance, there is this idea that the local phrase structures, so at the very early stage, for instance, the computation of the category of lexical item and the integration of the information about the categories with the syntactic structure would happen in the frontal operculum. So again, close to Broca's area, but not right in Broca's area. And that would elicit this effect called LAN or ELAN, which stands for left anterior negativity. So very bad violations like the pizza was in the eaten, right? Like phrase structure violation, word category violations. So very horrible syntactic violations, and also the anterior part of the STG. Okay. So the idea is that these local phrase structures information is computed in this kind of network. But then when you move to dependency relations, like move, then it's more Broca's area, right? So there is kind of convergence between neuroscience studies and this kind of more psychophysiological studies. And then the syntactic integration, which affects the famous P600 component, so positivity occurring at 600 milliseconds, which is quite late in time. That would be that would reflect also the integration of lexical information and syntactic information, revision process, repair processes, syntactic complexity, and stuff like this. And that would be reflecting the processing of the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus and the superior temporal sulcus. Okay. So you see this would be the posterior, this would be the anterior, and right here you have Broca's area. Okay. So I know this is a lot of information. It's just a kind of a teaser for you, right? But I want to ask you one question. Can anyone tell me where among these four areas here, where is what was called Wernicke's area? I told you this is Broca's area, so it can be here, right? I told you this is very close to Broca's area, so it can be here. So it's either here or here. Does anyone remember? Or does anyone want to guess?
I think it's in the posterior.
Please, take a guess.
Daniel, can you see the chat? There are some answers in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Because every time that I share, then the chat disappears. I don't know why. Sorry. Good. Yeah. The answer is good. Correct. So yeah, so Noor said STG, right? But they are both STG. That's why I wanted to ask you this. So it was a kind of a tricky question. So this is anterior STG and this is posterior STG, right? And yeah, this is where Wernicke's area is. So it's a portion of STG and a portion of SMG, okay? Super marginal gyrus. You don't really have to remember that by heart, but posterior STG, yes. And there is a lot of debate on the role of anterior and posterior STG, okay? So, for instance, Federici and a lot of people claim that actually that posterior STG is very important for syntax, and anterior STG is very important for this very, very low level local phrase structure thing. So between low level lexicon and low level syntax. Whereas posterior STG would be more high level syntax. For instance, again, placement and higher level syntactic operations, okay? Just to show you. Yeah, so this bloody hell. Yeah, so, okay, it's not what I wanted to show you. There you go. So if you look at the brain, the superior temporal gyrus is quite long. So it goes from almost your temporal pole, which would be right here, to back, the end of the temporal lobe, right? So it crosses the whole temporal lobe. I mean, this in a way is also true for the inferior frontal gyrus, but usually when we talk about the inferior frontal gyrus, we really refer to this small portion here. Whereas the STG is way more extended, right? Okay. All right. Is there any question or any problem at this point? There is one thing that should sort of pop up in your mind, given what we have seen in the previous lectures, right? And I would like you to tell me something about this, especially concerning these areas we're talking about. So we haven't talked a lot about Broca's area yet, but we have talked about STG and STS, right? When we were discussing phonological perception. This was exactly the areas that sort of were popping out in all the experiments that we have reviewed, right? So one question is, and now I'm telling you that these are the areas involved in syntactic processing, right? It's a little bit strange. So yes, these areas here, they are very, very multifunctional. Both Broca's area and superior temporal gyrus, superior temporal sulcus, okay? Especially the superior temporal gyrus basically surrounds your auditory cortex, your primary auditory cortex. So all these areas are always very active for acoustic tasks, right? And many people believe that these are just basically connecting, associating acoustic representations to certain higher level linguistic processes. So all they do is to put in communication to make available these acoustic representations to, for instance, Broca's area. But what these guys are claiming is rather different. They are claiming, no, not only does posterior STG implement core syntax, certain aspect of core syntax, but even anterior STG encodes different aspects of syntax, okay? So I'm just gonna leave it there, and just to basically try to highlight this problem. Okay, so Right. So the idea is that in this paper, they claim that it is possible cerebral localization of syntactic knowledge and to build certain language processing maps and to put these two things together. Okay. So they highlight that there is a correspondence between what we find in fMRI experiments and in MEG and EEG experiments. Okay. Now, this correspondence is not always perfect. For instance, there are different loci, right? But there is one thing in common. So different loci would mean, for instance, that again, it's very difficult to find specific activation for syntactic operation in the anterior part of STG. Whereas Frederici claimed that is very important for computing local dependencies, local syntactic dependencies, and category lexical category / syntactic category information. Like labeling, for instance, right? This kind of thing. But there is one thing that both these two domains have in common, which is the central role of Broca's area, of inferior frontal gyrus, okay? Plus additional regions on the left and the right. Okay, so there we come to the core part of our syntactic, neurosyntactic part of our course, the function of Broca's region. Okay. So this is a very, very nice paper about the role of Broca in syntactic processing, and it's called The Battle for Broca's Region. So the name itself tells you that there was a kind of, a sort of theoretical battle in the last 30, 40 years among people claiming that the same area, inferior frontal gyrus, BA44 and 45, would solve different functions. So some people claim action perception, right? Especially in monkeys, the homologous of Broca's area would be this F5, which is very important for action perception in monkeys. And it's well connected with the premotor regions. In fact, some people even claim that Broca's area is a premotor area. Other people say, no, it's working memory, in particular verbal working memory. Broca's area would be the area that retains some sort of representation of the words that you've just heard as I speak, so that information is available during higher order computation. Okay. For instance, if I tell you Broca's area is in inferior frontal gyrus, right? You hear Broca's area, you keep Broca's area in your memory, and then you hear inferior frontal gyrus, and then you try to compose this information together, following the syntactic structure, but you need something that is sort of retaining this information and prevent it from decaying. Otherwise, you're going to forget what I said, right? And that's exactly what they claim in some syndrome happens, that you have a damage to the working memory. You're not going to be able to understand what you are going to have some problems in comprehension, not because you have your semantic knowledge damaged, but because there is a short decay in the verbal information that you are perceiving because your working memory is damaged. Okay, so that's another possibility. And then there are two more syntactic-based hypotheses. One is syntactic complexity, and the other one is syntactic movement. Okay, syntactic complexity is a general definition that says basically the more complex your syntactic structures are, the more the bigger they are, the more operations they involve, the fancier operation they involve, the more complex they are, the more revision they require. Scrambling in German, for instance, scrambling is supposed to be a complex operation. Okay. WH movement, relative clause. They are more complex than a normal declarative, right? Or might be the case that Broca is functionally specialized to processing syntactic movement. So again, the example that I gave you. Why? Why do people think these things? Well, for instance, because the stuff of what I told you, because Broca's patients who have a selective damage to Broca's region, have specific deficits when it comes to producing and also comprehending certain structure that involves syntactic movement. Okay? So these are the options on the table: action perception, verbal working memory, syntactic complexity, or syntactic movement. Okay? Now, of course, one might say, look, Broca's area does all these jobs, right? But this was not, I mean, yeah, this was also an open possibility in these studies. But yeah, so the idea is that, according to these guys, is that we need to tease them apart. We need to tease these hypotheses apart and understand what's really going on in Broca's area. So they focus on the comprehension of relative clauses in Broca's aphasic patients. And this is a very nice pattern. So let's start with English, okay? So they notice that in Broca's aphasic patient native speaker of English, the comprehension of normal sentences is fine. The comprehension of passive sentences is impaired. So how do they test that? For instance, with a sentence picture matching task, okay? I show you this picture and I tell you, please show me this picture where the girl was dried by the woman. Okay. What is the right picture? What is the picture in which the girl is dried by the woman? Assuming that the girl is a child and a woman is more grown up. Is it this one or this one? Left or right?
Right.
Right.
Right. Good.
Right. Yes.
You did the task. Good. So yeah. So if you go at chance, so in some trials you say right and in some trials you say left, then you don't show understanding of these kind of structures. Okay, this is the way they tested it. But then when you go to relative clauses, a physics patient speaking of English would show a good understanding of subject relative clauses, like the cat that chased the dog was very big, right? The cat is the subject of the relative clause. Cat that, the cat is the dog. But impaired comprehension, of object relative clauses. So the cat that the dog chased the cat was very big. Okay. Okay. I know at this point you might wonder, well, this is not surprising. We know that passive sentences are more difficult to process than active sentences, and we know that object relative clauses are more difficult to process than subject relative clauses. No big surprise. Good. But then you go to China, or you investigate the performance of Mandarin speaking patients, and what you find is that actually Mandarin speakers are quite good with the object relative clause, but their performance is at chance with subject relative clause. So completely opposite pattern, right? Interesting. And if you go to Germany and investigate some German Broca's aphasic patients, they would be fine in both active and passive sentences. So the language under investigation produces different patterns of comprehension impairment with respect to different syntactic constructions. How is that possible, right? Right. So if you compare English to German again, passives, English chance, in German it's above chance. In Mandarin, subject relative is a chance, and in English it's above chance. Why? What is going on here?
Can I ask a question?
Please, please.
I think I may have just missed it, but what does it mean when we say chance and above chance?
Yeah. So basically, when you are at chance and you have to do a picture selection task, sometimes, like in 50% of times, you get the right picture, and in 50% of time, you get the wrong picture, okay? So performance at chance means that the ratio of selecting the correct picture is not significantly different from chance. Whereas above chance means that you do have a preference for the correct picture. Maybe your understanding is not perfect, but let's say it's like, I don't know, 70%, right? Would be significantly different from chance if, you know, if you have enough trials, and that would say that the comprehension of the structure is not completely impaired, okay? Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Right. So it's very common term for this kind of linguistic assessment or neurological assessment, basically, right? Or also in psycholinguistic experiments. When you're at chance, basically, it's as if you are randomly. It means that the pattern of your responses is not different from what would do someone just randomly pressing buttons. Okay. Good. So yeah, do you guys have any idea, any hypothesis about why we have these differences? Do you see any difference between what happens in English?
Could it be due to frequency with which it appears in the language ordinarily, in everyday language?
It could be due to frequency, right? But usually what these guys do is to check the frequency, to make sure that the frequency of this construction is quite similar. And I would be surprised if, I mean, of course, it could be that because of certain features of the language, right? In Mandarin, subject relative clauses are much rarer than in English, but it shouldn't be the case, right? These are kind of quite frequent and used quite often in everyday language. But yeah, good question. Could be frequency. So I think they did their homework and they checked for this. Okay, but yeah. Anything else? Just by looking at the sentences, do you notice any particular property? So let's have a look at the Chinese sentences. So if you want to say the cat that chased the dog was very big, right? The cat being the guy who chases the dog, you actually say chased dog, that cat, very big. So in the order of the words, your subject, your relative clause subject, the cat, has to move from here to here, right? If we assume that that's the position in which it is interpreted in the sentence. In English, it moves very, very, very little, right? It doesn't move because that is a relative pronoun, and this is the cat. Here, yeah, since this is the verb, in a way, it has to move, it has to move a lot. It has to move a lot. And
but
so this, yeah.
But then the sentence bracket has to be after the subject, after cat, because cat is not part of the relative clause. It's rather the matrix clause.
Right. So basically, I did something. I completely switched the things. Right. So yeah, you're right. So it's this that has to move after the. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So the cat is the subject, and therefore it has to be in front of the relative clause, and that too. So
right.
It seems that doesn't move, but yes.
Right. I mean,
cat does not belong to the relative clause.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. Please correct all the stupid things that I say about syntax. Please fix my mistake. Okay. So yeah. So a lot of big movement here, no movement here. So might be movement. And the same thing for object relative clauses, right? So here the cat has moved from this position to this position, right? But here, dog chased that cat very small. The cat that the dog chased was very big, is actually small. Here, can you help me here? Dog chased that cat. I guess there is a typo. No. So this is dog chase that cat. So doesn't he have to move here as well?
Yes, I think so. Because now cat is the object,
right?
And part of the relative clause, and let's just have to look. Yes, cat.
Right.
Yes, so, and cat would have to move into the relative clause, whereas the dog and cat would have to change their positions.
Right.
I think.
Right. But maybe it's the dog that moves here rather than the cat. Anyways, let's move on.
Yes, and at the noun, dog or cat has to. I think it has to be, or maybe not object relative clause. It is in front of the verb. So left adjacent, but
I might have the solution later. I might have the
Chinese.
Yeah, me too. I'm very bad with Chinese.
I think this is correct. It's just the relative clause appears before the noun in Chinese. Right? So what bracket is the relative clause. So in 5, there's a missing subject, which is the cat. Right? So the empty position, which is at the beginning of the sentence, is related to the cat. Right? And in 6, you have a missing object, right? So it's dog chased something. So that something is the cat. So in 5, the distance between the empty position and the head of the relative clause, which is the cat, is longer than the distance between the missing object and the head of the relative clause in 6.
Thanks so much, Yasu. Thank you very much. Right. So longer movement. Good. And yeah, and in German, if you compare the passive between English and German, again, this is clearer, right? Although my knowledge of German is also quite poor. The girl, basically, the girl was driven by the man. So the idea here is that was dry, the girl by the woman, sorry. Right, so the idea here is that the girl has to move from this position in which probably was the patient or the object. I'm not sure what kind of assumption they have for passive sentences, but if you compare that to German, where you have the father was hit by the son, so sorry, was by the son kissed. Here the subject movement has to cross was by the son, basically. So this fragment of sentence, including the verb, right, and the object. Whereas here, it only crosses the verb. Does it? Right. Sorry. Okay, now I got it. So the difference is that here, it does not cross the past participle. So it does not cross part of the VP, right? But the movement here is longer than here, or comparable. So it is not true that the length of the movement is a good predictor to show which sentences are understood and which are not. So let's see what they say. Okay, so we have seen this. We have seen this, right? So in English, in the passive sentences, the subject has to cross the whole VP. In German, it doesn't. And in the subject relative clauses, again, in English, there is very, very small movement. And in Chinese, there's a longer movement. And again, it has to cross. Is there a VP here? I don't know. No. Anyway, we have to cross more stuff. All right. So why? Well, the idea is that chance level involves the displacement of the noun phrase crossing the VP. So here, like I told you, the cat is crossing the dog chased. Here it's crossing, here is crossing the VP, which I don't know which one it is. No, here it's crossing the VP, right? Which I don't know which one it is. Here is not crossing the whole VP because the VP is here. It's kissed. Here it's not crossing the VP. Here it's not crossing the VP. Here it is crossing the VP. Here it is crossing the VP. Okay. So their prediction or their observation is that it's not really the length of the movement, but it's the feature of the special property of the movement, in particular, which kind of elements are crossed by the displaced element, and the critical element is the verb phrase. Okay. Right. So they say, it looks like Broca's region is selective for complexity and for movement, especially feature crossing. So we can rule out action perception, and we are left with these three guys because, if you have a more complex movement, then you have syntactic complexity, you have syntactic movement, but you also have verbal working memory, because if you have to keep more stuff in memory while you are displacing an element, which is specifically all the stuff that you're crossing, right? Then it also increments the processing load in verbal working memory. So first part was, okay, let's rule out action perception because the actions are the same, right? You are always comparing similar actions within the same test and then across languages. So that cannot be the critical property. So we're left with these three different hypotheses as to what kind of function Broca's area has. Then they take into account an fMRI study, with the parametric design, and you should know about the parametric design, right? Which basically you have a parameter that can vary, that can be varied continuously. So you can go from 1 to 2 to 3. And what do this number correspond to? The length of the movement, okay? So the sentence was, for instance, the grandpa has given the boy the lollipop. I mean, yeah. Today, can you translate these sentences for me? What is the difference between these three sentences? Can you tell me?
In the first sentence, the subject comes first, so the grandpa, then the indirect object, the boy, and the lollipop is the direct object. And
is this scrambling?
No. Maybe. Yes, I think so.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, this sentence involves 3 instances of displacement, right? This only 2, and this 1, right? Yes, because the OPA is the subject, right? So longer movement, more displacement. And they found that.
Sorry, can I just ask one question?
Please.
What do you exactly mean when you ask if it's a scrambling? I thought scrambling is something that makes the sentence not comprehensible.
Oh, that's an unfortunate ambiguity. Okay, so scrambling was scrambling the words in the sentence, right? But it's also a syntactic operation in German. So, which you basically change the order of the words. We talked about that in the other course, so we haven't talked about that here. Sorry, I presuppose this. Yeah. So it's a specific operation in German that affects the order of the constituents and also has some effects with respect to interpretation, but like kind of subtle. And there is a lot of debate about that. Okay. So, you know, I mean, in a kind of rough comparison, it's kind of focus fronting or topic movement, these syntactic operations that change the order of the word, okay?
And this applies only to German?
I guess you also have it probably in other Germanic languages, right? Definitely not in Italian, not in Romance languages, and not in English, right? Syntacticians, am I saying things that are reasonable? Can anyone support me with this? Okay.
Well, there is one question in the chat from Philip who asked if the sentence C is still correct German, that it might be a question for some German speaker.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea because my German is really bad, but these guys assume that, so this is not a violation. So it's supposed to be correct. I know that the Germans fight a lot about their intuition about scrambling. So what would you guys say? Is sentence C correct or not? In German? Thumbs up who thinks that it's correct. Okay, we have 1, 2, 3. Okay, and now thumbs up now who thinks that it's bad. Okay, nice. So it's definitely more complex, right? So right. So so that's also, you know, an interesting phenomenon. I'm gonna talk to Mike about this.
So sorry, what were the results in a quick survey?
Yeah. So it's kind of 50-50. I think 3-4 people said yes, and 3 people said it's bad. Dominique is saying that it is, but it's definitely marked. Okay. So yeah, so with scrambling, you can really make sentences more complex. And Frederici used it a lot also in older experiments with EEG. So we are going to look at other examples of this, even crazier examples. But I rely on your intuition because my intuitions with German are non-existent, okay? So anyways, what they found is that the more displacement and the longer displacement, the more activation in Broca's area. Then again, supports always the 3 hypotheses, right? So then, you know, this was all motivation for developing a new experiment that would specifically tackle the questions about what kind of operation is Broca's area sensitive to, okay? Should we take a little break? Or you want me to finish this stuff first? Raise your thumb who wants to take a break now. Break, break, break. Yes. See you in 5 minutes, okay? Let's resume record. All right, so yeah, so Santi and Groczynski in 2007, and this study is discussed in this review. Basically, so the question again is, you know, we have this nice pattern of data, right, from experiments and from aphasic patients, but this is still compatible with these 3 hypotheses, right? Because in all these cases where you have impaired comprehension, you have longer movement, you have more complex stuff, and you have, you know, more elements that have to be retained in the verbal working memory. So Santi and Groczynski came up with this very nice study where they compared 2 different kind of movement. In fact, 2 different kind of syntactic dependencies. One is NP displacement, right? Again, with the mailman and the mother of Jim love the woman who Kate burned. The mother of Jim loves the woman who the mailman and Kate burned. Kate loves the woman who the mailman and the mother of Jim pinched. So all these sentences are object relatives, right? The object is the woman, right? Which can cross 1, 2, or 3 constituents. And they compare this with the reflexive binding. So the sister of Kim assumes that Anne loves the man who burned himself, so the man burned himself. The sister of Kim assumes that the mailman who loves Anne burned himself, so himself has to cross Anne. Anne assumes that the mailman who loves the sister of Kim pinched himself. So now himself, the dependency between himself and the mailman have to cross Kim and the sister. All right? So we have the length of the movement that is manipulated parametrically from 1, 2, 3 or 0, 1, 2, and the kind of movement. One is XP movement, the other one is binding. All right? Assuming the binding is movement, or let's call it dependency. Yeah. Okay, so someone told me that it's good online teaching because then we can watch the lectures online. Yes, thank you. Right, so what about their prediction? So they said, okay, let's assume that Broca's area encodes working memory, right? Then we are expecting a linear effect in Broca's region, right? The more movement you have, the higher activation. And same for complexity, because the more movement you have, the more complexity you have. But according to the syntactic movement hypothesis, that Broca's encodes syntactic movement, then you would predict an interaction. Why? Because you would predict an effect in Broca's area only when you have XP movement and not a modulation of Broca's area activation when you have different binding distance, okay? So if Broca's area does not really care about binding, but only XP displacement, it should be only sensitive to XP displacement. And when you put these 2 factors together, basically one factor is going to stay here right? So Broca's activation is going to be constant across the length of the binding, but the other factor is going to be like here, like this. So you're going to predict an effect like this, which is, you know, a kind of a typical example of interaction, right? So we have interaction between factors with respect to a certain dependent variable. For instance, when the variable does not vary in one factor, but it varies with respect to the other factor, right? Another example of the interaction is like a cross pattern when the level 1 of one factor gives you the lower activation and the level 2 gives you the highest activation, and in the other factor the effect is inverse, okay? So this is not what we are predicting here. We are predicting that one factor is not going to affect Broca's area activation and the other factor will. What did they find? Yeah, so specifically this particular interaction is only predicted by the syntactic movement account, okay? So if we find this, we are in troubles because then we cannot decide between these two guys, but we can rule out syntactic movement. If we find this, we're happy. And guess what they found? That movement activates selectively Broca's area. So in your nice left inferior frontal gyrus, this is a picture from above, the coronal section of your brain. Then you have your interaction right here. Distance star type effect. Binding activates selectively right middle frontal gyrus, as I told you at the beginning of our class. In fact, they were referring to this study. And you see right middle frontal gyrus is on the right hemisphere and on the temporal cortex, so completely different area. And both activate the fusiform gyrus. Now, let's not talk about that a lot, just tell you that this area was sensitive to both factors, right? So yeah, they conclude that there is a highly structured role in Broca's region for syntactic movement. But is this the end of the story? For instance, Broca's region might be multifunctional, right? It could do all these jobs. So what they claim is that it would be nice to come up with a syntactotopic homunculus, which is sort of the parallel idea of the somatotopic or the motor homunculus that we have seen in the introductory, right? In the introduction. So that the abstract abilities are neurologically distinguished. And more work is needed to dissociate these syntactic dimensions. This is what they concluded in 2008, okay? And some new works have been done, but you know what we know is not that different from what I'm telling you now. All right, so let's move to another experiment, always by Santi Groczynski. So the question is there any selectivity in Broca's area for different syntactic dimensions? Okay, so we have compared two different operations. So we have compared binding to syntactic displacement. Displacement and movement are the same thing, right? But now this experiment is about the same kind of operation, which is in a way always displacement, but in two different constructions. So one is center embedding and the other one is right branching, okay? Again, example of center embedding, the boy who is chasing the girl is Derek versus right branching, Derek is the boy who is chasing the tall girl, okay? And then they compare that, dubbing these conditions canonical word order and non-canonical word order, so that they would be understandable for neuroscientists who understand very little, who know very little about grammar, okay? But these are subject and object relatives, right? So the boy is chasing the tall girl is Derek. The boy who the tall girl is chasing, the boy, is Derek. Derek is the boy who the tall girl is chasing, right? So two factors. center embedding, right branching, subject, object movement. So sorry, subject, object, relative close. Okay. Why do we care? Why do we even care about this? Well, we know from psycholinguistics that center embedding is more difficult to process than right branching. And also it's kind of intuitive. So why? Because center embedding separates the heads from the main clause. And also you have some sort of possible interference between subject-verb agreement dependency. So you see that between the boy, who's the subject of the main clause, and Derek, so the subject has to agree with the verb, right? In between, there is all this relative clause. Whereas in right branching, again, the distance is much, much, much shorter, okay? And also, sorry, and also there is nothing between the subject and the VP of the main clause, right? So the problem about center embedding is that the relative clause really sits in between the subject and the verb. So we know that that's difficult overall, right? And then we know that the boy needs to be kept active in working memory until you hit the verb. Because if you don't have that, then bye-bye to your agreement processing, okay? So, yeah. So, right, so this is interesting. This is an interesting thing about center embedding and right branching. And what about object versus subject? Again, we know from psycholinguistics that object movement is more difficult than subject movement. Why? Because in the object movement, the link between the subject and the empty gap is longer. So what I was saying before, right? So here you have to return the boy memory, you get the whole relative, and at the end of the relative, you have your trace. Here, your trace is really, really close to your antecedent. Okay, so there is the boy, who the boy, whereas here there is the boy, who blah 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 blah, and then the boy. Okay, is this clear? Okay. So yeah, so nouns must be kept in working memory for longer. And also it crosses a lot of syntactic features. So if you're interested about syntactic intervention, the holy grail, the Bible of intervention is relativized minimality, Rizzi, 1990, okay? And what it says is that the kind of features that are carried by the element that is moved, and the kind of features that the element moved is crossing matters for processing cost, for the difficulty that is predicted in language acquisition to acquire these operations, and for impairment in a phasic patient, okay? It's not just the length of the movement, it is the quality, especially the kind of features that are involved in the operation. All right, so what is cool about this study is not just the interesting design, but also the methodology they used, okay? So this is something new we haven't talked about. Usually we have a stimulus and then you expect higher activation, right? Or a certain level of activation. Here they're using a different methodology. So first of all, they had a working memory. This is just an example of working memory. Okay, we talked about that. Right. So why do we care about this dimension? So embedding and movement impose cognitive load on working memory, right? And so the idea is, can we separate the overall load to working memory to different operations? So if Broca's area is only sensitive to working memory, it shouldn't care, right? But if Broca's area is sensitive to different syntactic operations, then yes. So it is difficult to address this question with standard methodologies, and it was never been addressed with imaging studies. So what they did was to adopt an fMRI adaptation method, okay? So you remember with fMRI, what you're really testing with the bold with the BOD methodology is the amount of oxygenated blood that is flowing to the area of the brain that is asking for resources, right? So the more oxygenated blood you have, the higher signal you're going to get. Now, what you should know, what I'm going to tell you now about the brain is that it has been long known that certain areas of the brain show adaptation. For instance, if I do this task, this was this very famous experiment that I don't remember the name. My neuroscience professor would kill me for this, right? So if you do this, if you keep on doing this, at some point in your primary motor cortex, the area that is controlling the movement of the finger, as you keep on doing that, is going to be activated less because it adapts. It's kind of learning to do the same thing over and over, and it's going to require less energy, okay? This is a general property of our cognitive system, and that is really important for saving resources, because if you have to repeat the same operation or the same task, then at some point you're going to automatize this task, therefore use less resources, okay? So what you expect in with the adaptation method is exactly the opposite at what you would expect with the normal activation methodology, okay? That is that the region that processes something that has been repeated is going to show a decrement in activation, okay? So when you have that something is repeated, you're going to have a lower activation of a certain area. So now we're not going to look for an increase in activation, but for a decrease in the activation, okay? Now, in order to use this strategy, you have to develop the right experimental design. There you go. Maximally similar sentences where they would change only one or two nouns, okay? Like the waitress who the lawyer is smiling at is Diana. The waitress who the lawyer is smiling at is Diana. Sorry, the witness who the lawyer is smiling at is Diana, okay? And then they would employ an irrelevant task just to make sure that the participants were focusing on the sentences, like how many chains occurred, one chain or two changes, okay? And they could be one or two. Here would be one, okay? Now the trick was to show the two possible conditions, one after the other. So here you would have a center embedding and center embedding, and this is object. Here you would have center embedding and right branching, and this is an object and this is a subject relative. Here you would have center embedding and right branching, subject, subject. So object, object, subject, subject. And here you would have right branching and center embedding, object to subject. Basically, in these two comparisons, you have the same movement and you expect adaptation to movement, okay? Because, right, because this, yeah, this is, yeah, subject and subject, object and object, okay? In these conditions here, you would have the same embedding, center embedding, center embedding. I think this is a mistake, right? This should be subject, shouldn't be object, I think, yeah. So here, you would have the same kind of embedding. So object, object, subject, subject. No, sorry. I'm getting confused. Object, subject, object, subject, object. Right. Here's the typo. So here you have either center embedding, or right branching, right branching. Okay. So the trick is that when you are repeating just one of these two features, you're going to get adaptation. So when you repeat the kind of embedding, you should get an adaptation for embedding, but not for the kind of movement. When you repeat the same kind of movement, you should have an adaptation for the movement, but not for the embedding. Okay. So here you change the movement, and here you change the embedding. Is this clear? So, yeah, thank you. So what we're really interested now is to look for a decrease in activation, right, on a certain dimension. And guess what? They found that adaptation to both movement and embedding was localized in the left superior temporal gyrus, right here. Instead, as well, adaptation to both movement and embedding was found also in the inferior precentral sulcus. Okay, so again, in the frontal lobes, not far from Broca's area. And again, this was mentioned in the first slides. So both these areas showed effect to both movement and embedding. So you see the adaptation, right? Means that this blue line is significantly, it represents a condition that is significantly less activated during the second stimulus from the first. Okay. Now, what about Broca's? So interestingly, they found that Broca's area did not respond uniformly to the two different factors. The posterior part of Broca's area, BA44, was sensitive to movement and embedding, but the anterior part only to movement. Okay. And you see here the difference in activation. So here only the blue line represents a decrease in activation, whereas here both the blue and the green show a decrement in activation. See that, right? So from this, they concluded, look, interesting. One part of Broca's area is really sensitive to both dimensions, but the other part only to movement. There is an anatomical division in syntactic complexity in the brain and a functional parcellation. This word means that if you take an area, you can subdivide an area within smaller regions. That's called parcellation, and it's functional because it's dependent on their function. The other kind of parcellation it can be anatomic parcellation by looking at anatomic differences, or cytoarchitectonic parcellation if you're looking at differences, for instance, in the tissue, like in the layers of cells. Okay, this will be functional parcellation. Left anterior inferior frontal gyrus, BA45 movement, BA44 more posterior in Broca's areas, and STG movement and embedding. So one question that we can ask about this is whether this is really about syntax, right? When you displace an MP, then MP may have different theta roles, right? Maybe the subject, maybe the object. In particular, these are associated with the, theta roles, agent, patient, right? So often with transitive verbs, the subject is also the agent and the object is the experiencer or the patient, right? So these things actually have a very strong semantic effect, semantic implication, right? So it could be the case that we are considering different kind of movement but actually what we are doing is also to consider different kind of theta roles, which are semantically important. Right. So Derek is the boy who's chasing the girl. He's the subject and he's the agent. Derek is the boy who the girl is chasing. He's the object, but he's also the patient, right? The experience, the one who's the one to which the action is being made. To whom? Right. So, semantic differences could play a role too. And actually, when I raise these doubts, I think I was kind of on the right side, because now it's kind of more it's more shared, the idea that you have a gradient of syntax and semantics within Broca's area, where the most posterior part, BA44, is really specific for syntax, is very selective for syntax, whereas semantic processing is more anterior, especially towards 45 and 47. Okay. Good. So that's quite interesting. Right. But who cares about semantics? Well, let's see in the next slide. Okay. Maybe I should stop here, because that's a kind of a nice time to stop before introducing this other experiment. But please ask me something. Give me some feedback, some questions, some doubts, some thoughts. Do you buy this story, or do you have some criticism about these conclusions? I know it's a lot of stuff to process, but is this clear to you? Is this the rationale of these experiments and the kind of results they provide?
I would say it's pretty straightforward, but it's 10 years old, so maybe there was some progress. I don't know, but it's pretty clear from what you showed us. So
good, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, there has been made some progress, right? And especially this other study that we're going to look at by Zaccarella and colleagues, always from Frederici's lab, is another study that we're going to look at. They try to refine this idea that there is a functional parcellation within Broca's area. And a common problem of this kind of experiments is, besides the idea that it's not clear how to exactly have a pure syntactic stimulation, or to isolate at the level of processing a process that we say it's only syntactic or it's only semantics, because we know that syntax and semantics at some level are paired together. They are matched, especially compositional semantics. So it's one of the problems is always to tease apart these issues. The other problem is that if you present stimuli, if your stimuli are words or sentences, right, it is always difficult to identify a task which is not going to add some nuisance factors, some noise, right? For instance, every time you have lexical access to words, then you have some semantics processing going on. So it's really about, it's really the very first question that I think you raised in the introductory lesson, that was, how can we be sure that our control condition is really doing what we want it to do, right? So it's oftentimes that in very many experiments, the control conditions was just to take the same sentence and scramble the words, right? So to randomize the order of the word. Now, if you do that, you might give rise to any sort of crazy effects, right? If you take a sentence in Italian or in English, like, the mom slaps the child, and you scramble the word, you might come up with a sentence which is a child slaps the mom, which is completely understandable. right? So a lot of criticism, not to these particular studies, but to older studies, was that their task was not pure enough or was not focusing enough onto the operation that it was purported to investigate. Okay, and this is going to be exactly the kind of criticism that Taccarella and colleagues moved against previous studies, where they said, you know, people claimed they were investigating composition and they got a large activity in the brain, but maybe they got this widespread activity because their task was not pure enough to investigate syntactic composition. Okay? So yes, this is what we are going to do next time. And next time we will try to finish the neurosyntax part, at least this part, and then we're going to be able to move on to the ERP studies, so to the studies that are focused to see the activation in real time with a higher time resolution, and in particular to investigate how different brain waves emerge from the interaction of several neuron structures. Okay, so the next class is going to be on Wednesday at 5 p.m., right? And yeah, if there are no other questions, I think that's it for today. So see you in a couple of days.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.